Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the LaSalle Public Library Zoom programming. Before we start tonight's program, I just want to make a couple of announcements, as we always do on upcoming programs. Coming up next on June 8th will be Natalie Martin, our gardener, master gardener, and great cook, continuing her series of Grow Your Own, and this time will be Grow Your Own main dishes and sides. So don't forget to mark your calendar for this one, because Natalie will be featuring recipes that look similar to what you see on your flyer. Following that, on June 15th, we have an Illinois Humanities funded program about Everett Dirksen, one of most noteworthy but humble federal representatives, he's a senator in Illinois, and a significant person in passing Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is an extremely amazing program. I hope you'll be able to join us. Tiffany White is director of the Dirksen Congressional Center, and she will be presenting that program. And finally, just again, we had this one up last week. Kate Moore, author of The Woman They Could Not Silence. Please join us for that author program. That's on an unusual time and date for us, Saturday, June 26th at 2 o'clock. Now, I know that our speaker tonight, John Garofalo, author of the book Dickey Chapelle Under Fire, is having a little technical adjustment with his lights, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And are you there, John?
I am here.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And there's John, and welcome, John. And I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you take it away, and we'll just keep this nice and casual and go from there.
All right, sounds good. Nice and casual is good for me too. So I have to say, Donna, when you were introducing, you mentioned the words humble, and I don't know the one, but it's a great platitude. Oh, she's talking about me. That's really nice. And then, of course, I heard that you weren't. So I'll try and overcome my disappointment for the rest of the presentation. However, so hello everyone, and thank you for participating. As Donna said, I'm going to repeat it just because my name is John Garofalo, and I'm the author of Dickey Chapelle Under Fire. So I've been working on Dickey's story for more than 25 years. So that either is a testament to my tenacity or an indictment of my insanity. And I've never really figured out exactly which one is which. However, I think that Dickey Chapelle is a fascinating character. I feel that it's an injustice that for those of you who may not have ever heard of her, have never heard of her before, because I think that she really is a unique person that should have a wider recognition from what she really has, which isn't that much. I'd like to sort of coin my sense of this is that Dickey Chapelle has become a historical footnote, and that's really a shame. So we're going to talk about Dickey tonight, and hopefully you'll get a chance to find out what it is about Dickey that I think is so interesting and why she should have more recognition than she does. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here. If you have any questions, if you can, hold them till the end. Obviously, there's something that on the chat or something that's relevant to exactly where I'm at in the discussion. We can go ahead and address it then. But I find that most questions are answered by the time that we get to the end of the presentation. So if you'll bear with me, well, now I have to do the unpleasant task of handing off and getting ourselves into the right, getting into the right screen. So I'm going to go ahead and I think I've got that located. And where is my share screen? Ah, there we go. It's right in the front in green. All right, so. And we're supposed to be sharing a screen. Oh, you know what? I've got to change the view. So that's probably really helpful. Let's do this. There we go. All right. So here's a copy of the book that I wrote, Dickey Chapelle Under Fire, Photographs by the First American Female War Correspondent Killed in Action. And what's important about that is it tells you in some respects why Dickey Chapelle actually has some degree of notoriety, more so than the average war correspondent might have, particularly women war correspondents. That's because she was the first one killed in action, and that's pretty significant. There was actually a war correspondent that was killed prior to Dickey, who was Hungarian. Her name was was Gerda Taro. And for those of you who may know war photography, at the time she was a very, very well-known photographer named Robert Capa's girlfriend. So she was killed actually in the Spanish Civil War, where they are both working and covering the war. But as far as American war correspondents are concerned, she's the first female. So I'm going to go ahead and get to the next screen next. So there's a couple of quotes that I came across, and this is one of my favorites. It was actually for a long, long time, misattributed to various people, including Plato, by General Douglas MacArthur in his farewell speech. He actually specifically said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war," and specifically attributed to Plato. So that's been a very, very common attribution. And one time I decided to look up exactly if that was really the case, and it turns out that it wasn't. So it looks like that apparently George Santayana, who's actually had some other well-known quotes, is apparently the originator of that particular statement. I think it's true. And I think it's particularly important to understand that from the perspective of a war correspondent who was really interested in showing how horrible war was, to demonstrate to people that maybe this is a bad idea for human beings to engage in this kind of activity, because it's so devastating for any number of reasons. And obviously there doesn't seem to be any appetite for humanity to kind of slow down that appetite for war. So that's the Santayana quote. So this is one that was one of my heartbreakers in the book. There were a couple of heartbreakers. This happened to be one of them. And this was, I didn't find this quote until after the book was too far along in order to make it in. But I think it is a great quote by Salman Rushdie. "A photograph is a moral decision taken in 1/8 of a second." And so when I look at Dickey's work, what I see is not just 23 or 24,000 photographs, whatever it may have been. There were 23 or 24,000 moral decisions that she made. And I think that it's very, very apt in particular about what was important to Dickey as she was doing her work. So obviously it was to reveal the truth, but I think there's a little bit more to it. She actually was looking at the humanity of the participants, and then also those who were affected by war. Now, before I go any further, get to the next slide, I want to make sure everybody can hear me. So I don't know, actually, Donna, can you verify that you can hear me? And I'm assuming everybody else will have about the same audio level.
That's right. Your volume is just perfect.
All right, great. So moving on. So this is one of those photographs that it's jarring. It's horrific to look at, but from Dickey Chapelle's perspective, it was something that I believe that she would want people to see, because it tells you everything that you need to know about Dickey Chapelle. And that is, she knew the work that she was doing as a war correspondent was dangerous, and she understood that the consequences could be something like her ending up lying in a field in Vietnam in a pool of her own blood. So this happens to be an interesting photograph in and of itself. The chaplain that's kneeling behind her and giving last rites was a Catholic chaplain. He was a priest who later on actually became a bishop. Before that, he was elevated to Rear Admiral, and he was in charge of the Navy's chaplain corps, which I thought was kind of interesting. I didn't know that for a long time until I decided to look. And then after that, he became a bishop in the Boston Archdiocese before he died. But this is a very, very shocking and jarring picture. And a lot of times, as I mentioned, what people know Dickey about, if they do know anything about her work, is that she was the first American female war correspondent killed in action. And so I don't want that to be sort of the be all and end all of the Dickey Chapelle story. I think that it's sort of where it ends, but it's not where the story begins. And so that's what I want to focus on, not so much about how Dickey Chapelle died, but how Dickey Chapelle lived, because I think that's much more compelling and much more important. This is the thing that gets everybody's attention, but it really is just the tip of the iceberg of her story. So this is the Dickey Chapelle that I like to remember. This is her favorite photograph taken of herself at work. And it was taken actually in Milwaukee in 1958 at the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway. So it's kind of interesting. There's a big military exercise going on there. And the person who took the photograph was a Marine Corps sergeant named Lewis Lowry, who was noteworthy because he was a combat photographer during World War II when he was actually on Iwo Jima, and he was one of the guys that took a photograph of the first flag raising on Iwo Jima. So he had a storied career as a Marine Corps combat correspondent, and then, of course, continued on his career and still managed to catch this picture of Dickey before he retired from the Marines. And of course, she continued on with her work for a little while. But I think it's a great picture, and it's just, to me, this is the Dickey Chapelle that I want to remember as for the kind of person that she was and the way that she lived. So going back to her story, she was born in Milwaukee. She lived in a Milwaukee suburb called Shorewood. Her family was a family of pacifists, which was very, very common after World War I. It was such a horrible war. I mean, they called it the war to end all wars for a reason. And unfortunately, that wasn't exactly the case. But still, it did spark a wave of pacifism, which her parents were caught up with. So it's ironic that she was raised in a family of pacifists, and she was drawn to reporting on war. In fact, I know her brother also had been raised in the same family, obviously. And then during World War II, he actually had enlisted in the Army when he was old enough to do so. This photo is actually an interesting one to me because it's a picture of her standing by a Coast Guard seaplane in Boston. This was taken when she was at MIT, and she was a really smart kid. She was a valedictorian of her high school class and had a scholarship to MIT. And she was one of the first small group of people, of women, that had attended MIT. So she studied aeronautical engineering, but her real passion was going out and doing stuff like this. And so she was hanging out at the local Coast Guard base and the Navy base, which, I'm sure her parents were thrilled to death about. And while it was helpful for her to get an early story published about the way that actually the folks that were running search and rescue cases with aircraft were using a certain type of telemetry in order to, keep track of their aircraft and, and the potential rescuee if they were so lucky. So again, she was like 16 or 17 years old in this picture. So I think that it was just, again, interesting. I'm thinking that nowadays, I spent 30 years in the Coast Guard, and I can't imagine how it would go over when you have a bunch of 16 or 17-year-old girls hanging out with a pilot and air crew. So you could tell things have obviously changed a lot in all those years. So this was her as a younger girl. I think she believes she was probably in about middle school in this picture. And, so she was a very, very smart kid. As I mentioned, she graduated as a valedictorian in the days when there was only one. But one of the questions that I always get every single time without fail, so I'm going to preempt the question, is how did she get the name Dickey? And it's like, well, she was born Georgette Meyer, and she became a fan of this guy. And of course, since it's not really a two-way street at this moment, I just will have to go along and just tell you who it is to kind of alleviate the suspense here. But this is a photo in civilian clothes of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, who was the famed explorer of the Antarctic. And of course, he was very, very famous about the time Dickey was 10 or 11 years old, and she became totally enamored with Byrd. He's a good-looking guy, and he had this great life of adventure and all this stuff, and that kind of triggered her interest in aviation and being an adventurer. And she also liked Byrd, whose nickname was, to his family, his name was Richard Dick Byrd. To the press, he was Dickey Byrd. And so she adopted Dickey as her nickname, and then eventually just kind of it stuck with her for the rest of her adult life as her professional name. So kind of going back to the 16 or 17-year-old girl hanging out with a bunch of sailors. Here's one of the photos of her at the Navy base, looking very, very sophisticated and smoking a cigarette with a couple of aviators. And as soon as I saw that, my daughter's now 20, but she was probably 14, 15 at the time when I came across this picture. I said, there's no way in hell that if I ever knew about this, that I probably wouldn't have taken the first train at that time out to Boston and, probably had a stern talking to, or maybe taken her someplace else and had a stern talking to these two knuckleheads. So as we're moving along in the story of her life, she eventually had gotten out of MIT 2 years early because she flunked out, spending all that time with the pilots of the Coast Guard and Navy bases and writing stories instead of attending classes did eventually take its toll. So she did leave ingloriously after 2 years, and then had to find other things to do. So I'm going to probably skip through a big chunk of that story because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm not going to go too much into her post-war life, but or post-MIT life. But she did spend some time working at air shows, starting in Milwaukee, going down to Miami and Cuba. And she ended up from that getting a job at TWA. in New York in the publicity department, where she met this character whose name was Tony Chapelle. Now, Tony was 20 years older than she was. He had been a World War I veteran, and he was a classically trained photographer who was head of TWA's photo department. So he actually used to do photography lessons on the side. So he had taken Dickey under his wing as one of his photo students. And of course, the two of them fell in love and ended up getting married, much to her parents' consternation, because Tony was 20 years older than Dickey was. So they were a little concerned about that. But it worked out in the end, because when her parents actually had a chance to meet him, which was at their wedding for the first time, they actually got married at the family home. Her mother in particular was really, really thrilled that she finally would have adult supervision, and and it generally worked out, but not always. But needless to say, it did work out for Dickey for a number of years. Tony was a very good photographer, and he was instrumental in teaching her photography, so that expanded her range. She had already decided that she wanted to be a writer and a journalist, but now she was able to go ahead and take pictures, and so she worked pretty hard at learning photography under Tony's tutelage. Although she basically says that he was a pretty hard taskmaster, and essentially that if for whatever reason that the photographer didn't get the picture, it was the photographer's fault. It had nothing to do with the pictures, or it had nothing to do with your film. If your film wasn't loaded, it was your fault. You should have had it loaded the night before. If you didn't get the shot, it's like, well, you didn't try hard enough. And if it was a high shot, you need to get up on a ladder. If it was a low shot, you need to climb up on the ground. So it was very, very unforgiving about any excuses as far as never missing the shot. So anyway, interesting character and pivotal in Dickey's life, because even though they did get divorced after 15 years of marriage, they did have a rough spot for a year or so afterwards, but they did reconcile, and they stayed friends up until the end of her life. And so that was a very, very sincere and very, very strong friendship. So it did all work out in the end, even though he really was a philanderer. His son, Ron, who just passed away a few years ago, had told me that he thinks that Tony was married 5, maybe 6 times, but nobody's really sure exactly. So again, he was quite a character. So now we're moving to when Dickey is married to Tony. This is about 1942, and this is a photo that I believe was taken by Tony, and it does have some of those classically trained or classic black and white photograph of the 1930s sort of a look. George Hurrell, for those of you who know, famous Hollywood photography. It's very, very contrasty, shadowy, and all that. And so it really is a great model of that. And plus, Dickey looked really, really good in that photo. So when World War II rolled around, her husband immediately went and re-enlisted in the Navy, and then was very quickly deployed to Panama, which was at the time considered to be a war zone. And so all the Navy dependents that were there, if they were there before the war happened, were shipped out, and then there were no dependents that were left. And so the way that Dickey actually became a war correspondent was somewhat by accident, because what they realized, it's like, okay, so if I was as a Navy dependent can't go to Panama, to the base that you're at, well, what about me getting a credential as a war correspondent and going down there as a war correspondent on assignment, which is exactly what she ended up doing. So her becoming a war correspondent was not necessarily by design. It just sort of worked out that way. But once she sort of got into that world, she really liked it quite a bit. In fact, that she kept on doing it for a long time. So eventually what happened is she finished with her assignment in Panama, or Tony finished with his assignment in Panama. And there's a story about how she basically got kicked out of Panama once they realized that she wasn't a legitimate, well, she was a spouse and she was a legitimate war correspondent. They still didn't like the way that she sort of had worked the system in order to get over there. So they sent her back home. So after a couple of years, she was able to get a set of orders from the Navy to cover the battle at Iwo Jima. So while she was there, she was actually off the shore of Iwo Jima on a hospital ship. And so her first entry into combat correspondent work was as a reporter covering the wounded, tons of wounded coming off of Iwo Jima. For those of you who don't know, it was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. And I think it had the highest number of casualties in Marine Corps history in one battle, which there were 26,000 casualties. And in fact, there were actually more casualties by the Marines than there were by the Japanese defenders. Partially that was a function of that there were only 20 or 21,000 Japanese defenders on the island, most of whom did not survive the battle. There were a number of short-term survivors, most of whom died thereafter, and there were a few prisoners of war. But the Marines did have a pretty tough fight with the Japanese that were there. So again, just a few more photos of some of the wounded that she took on board the ship. And then eventually she was able to get herself onto the island of Iwo Jima. So for those of you, this is taken from the Iwo Jima airfield, this was taken during the combat operations phase. This area had been secured. In the background, you see Mount Suribachi, which is where the famous flag raising on Iwo Jima had taken place. This here happens to be one of her most reproduced photos. And she used to say this in her autobiography. She said it was her most reproduced photograph ever. But I think that afterwards, she had several articles in National Geographic that I think eclipsed that in terms of views of the photograph. But this was a photo that was released with a caption of "The Dying Marine." And Dickey actually wasn't that thrilled with that, believe it or not, mainly because while the guy was seriously wounded, he survived. He didn't die, but it's very, very dramatic. And in terms of her mission with being on Iwo Jima, her job was to try and demonstrate how whole blood was used by the fleet, because blood donations were on the decline. And so they're hoping that pictures like this would spark Americans to go ahead and increase their blood donation quite dramatically, because obviously the next battle after this was the Battle of Okinawa, and that's not even taking into account other battles that were happening that were not quite as large but still significant. This is a photo that she took on Okinawa, and it's one of my favorites from Okinawa. It just happened to catch a Marine, and you can see that his weapon is all wrapped up. And so that was, it wasn't a flagpole, but they basically were wrapping their weapons up, and things like that. And so it was just, again, capturing one of those moments. You can kind of see that they were still wearing leggings back in 1945, and they had camouflage on their helmets, but their uniforms were still the fairly standard, green fatigues that we were still actually issuing up until through the Vietnam War. So the Okinawa story is kind of interesting because while Dickey was there and got some interesting pictures, she wasn't supposed to be there. She had gone ashore without permission. And unfortunately, the Navy figured that out. And so after about 10 days, they actually sent a party out to get her off the island. In fact, the first orders were to arrest and shoot on sight if necessary. I think that was overly dramatic, and that might have been over dramatized by the Marines that actually had seen her and did take her back to a ship that brought her back to Guam and got her off of the island. But while there may have been some applause for her tenacity and the fact that she attached herself to a Marine medical unit, courtesy of a general named Lemuel C. Shepard, who was the commander of the 6th Marine Division, and he reluctantly allowed her to stay in his operating area, and then hooked her up with the Marine medical units that were moving forward as the battlefield kept on changing. But that was actually something that would help her later on. But at that time, the Navy withdrew her military press credentials, which you needed in order to continue on as a military war correspondent. So basically, her career as a war correspondent ended in 1945. And so when she came back home, she had to try and figure out what to do. So she worked as a photographer and, an editor, photographer, and writer for 17 magazine, which was actually fairly new at that point. And so based on that kind of inspired her to do some relief work, because one of the stories that she did, let me see if I've got that in there. I don't have it in there. So one of the stories that she did was from a camp that was run in Kentucky by the American Friends, which are Quakers. And so it was one of those things that she started feeling the sense that this is something that's kind of important. And, and it actually made her realize that other than covering war, there might be some other things that are important enough that she felt it would be worth putting her time into. And so she was able to use some of her contacts with the American Friends in order to get an overseas assignment, in order to go ahead and continue focusing. I think this one is, no, that's something else, with the Quakers relief work. And then what ended up happening is she actually wouldn't be able to go if she wasn't going with a male. So she actually had to talk her husband to go, which he did not want to go at all. He was, the last thing he wanted to do was leave his comfy existence in New York at the time and then go tramping around in that truck or truck like that, working for different relief agencies and things, and seeing the rebuilding of the world after World War II, or Europe after World War II, which was pretty bleak and depressing. And but needless to say, she won that argument, and they continued doing this for quite some time. They worked for multiple relief agencies, and then eventually all the funding from these various government organizations or the non-government organizations ran out. So she and Tony created this little entity that was essentially, they were freelance reporters that were reporting specifically on relief efforts throughout the war. So they just extended their time traveling in Europe and the Middle East for a long time. So it was the friend, I can't remember now, it was the American Volunteer Information Services. So it was just this kind of this really created of their own volition and came up with their own name and all that. So they lived in that truck in addition to work. Now, just imagine, after going through a year of quarantine with my wife, who I love dearly, and my daughter, who has been doing her college classes remotely here, I can see how it might be sort of challenging to be living and working with your wife in that truck. So I got to imagine that this probably had something to do with the strain that was later on their marriage that led to the divorce a few years later. So they did eventually get a divorce, not a big surprise, after his serial infidelity. Finally, just really Dickey got tired of Tony's, constant infidelity, and so they divorced. They did have their tough times, but what she did was she went back to contact General Lemuel C. Shepard, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps, and requested his assistance in getting her military press credentials back, because in the 1950s you still needed to have a military press credential in order to do that work. So he was willing to help her, and so she was able to get back into the game as a war correspondent. And the first story that she did, which actually was never published, was following a Marine recruit company down to Camp Pendleton while they were doing their initial recruit training. And again, it got her back into the game as a war correspondent, but that story just never went anywhere. But it did lead to her doing other kinds of things like this. She was, you can probably tell, she's the person in the back with the camera, leaning on a Marine who was in Lebanon at the time. So this was one of the late 1950s incursions that the Marines had in Lebanon, in Beirut. So it was, another, as she called them, banana war, or the banana border, so to speak. But I think it's a really interesting photo because it's the only one that I've seen where she literally is this close to somebody who's got a rifle that's, essentially in a tense situation. So it's one of my favorites from that. I wish it was a little bit better quality, but I think it still is clear. You can kind of see what's going on here. So from there, she ended up getting an assignment with Life magazine in order to document the Hungarian uprising. So it was sort of a double-edged sword or double-edged benefit, because at the time she was doing some PR work for the International Rescue Committee. And so the International Rescue Committee had prevailed upon her to go out to Hungary to deliver penicillin that was donated, I think it was actually by Pfizer, by the drug company, to bring to Hungarian refugees that were fleeing Hungary and crossing over in the border, mostly into Austria. So she was able to take advantage of the fact that she had this experience covering, the rebuilding of Europe and the Middle East from 1950 something, 1947 to the early 50s, 53, 54. And so she was able to leverage that into getting the assignment with Life magazine. It was just happenstance that she had been working for the International Rescue Committee that led to sort of all of this happening. So here's one of the pictures that she took that ended up in Life magazine, which was great picture. It's literally Hungarian refugees crossing the border. So, and you can see some of the markings and things like that from the original picture. But the problem is that as Dickey was going through the whole Hungarian Revolution thing, the Hungarians were not looking very kindly on members of the media. And so the danger that she had sort of gotten herself into, that her husband actually kind of, maybe tried to persuade her from going, is that reporters were getting shot if they were identified as reporters by the Hungarians and probably the Russians as well. And so again, there was definitely some danger. And so what she was doing in order to get this picture, she was actually helping smuggle refugees across the border, and then of course, giving the penicillin to the Hungarian refugee organizations. The problem is that one night she got lost and got caught by a Russian patrol, her and a few of the other folks from the Hungarian refugee organizations. So that got her 2 months in Hungarian prison. So in her book, she actually sort of downplayed some of the difficulties in that particular prison. She was there for almost 2 months. She spent 30 days in solitary confinement. She was subjected to routine interrogations because they were trying to get her to admit she was a spy so they could execute her. Well, you could argue that she may or not have been a spy, but she did have a spy camera that she was, a little miniature camera. And that's what she was using to avoid, essentially being obvious with her pictures. So just double checking time, we're good. She had realized that this was a bad thing, but obviously when she was captured by the Russians, turned over the Hungarians, they were driving her over to the prison in Budapest, the Budapest Main Street prison that was known as the House of Horrors at the time. She decided that she cannot be found with that camera because it would be a really bad thing. So she was actually able to sort of somehow or other pull the camera that she had taped inside her bra and throw it outside the window with a lit cigarette in order to distract the two sort of Hungarian thugs that were driving in the car. And if they had found that camera, chances are she wouldn't have had a career that extended beyond 1956. So they were pretty serious about, about making sure that the story of the Hungarian uprising didn't get out. We see those kinds of things still happening today. I mean, you have reporters that are killed all across the world on a fairly regular basis, which is really unfortunate. But, when you think about it, most people that are, let's just say you're Hafiz al-Assad in Syria or Bashir al-Assad in Syria, you probably don't want much reporting about what's going on while you're essentially killing your own population in order to maintain your power. So that just never goes over really well when the media is there to essentially provide an impartial view. And of course, you may know that not too long ago, Marie Colvin, who was a reporter, she was an American reporting for the British Times in London, or the London Times, and she'd been doing that for a long time. She was killed in Syria. So she was the second American female war correspondent killed in action. And of course, the wrinkle on the Marie Colvin story is that her family had asserted that they were targeting the building that she was in because they knew that she was there and they wanted to stop her from reporting that story. So, that may or may not be the truth, but certainly it does ring true, knowing the fact that most people tend not to want to have their dirty laundry aired for an international audience, particularly dictators. So getting through all of that, and I do unfortunately always have to cut too many things for time, which drives me crazy when I always get to this spot, because this is Dickey in Vietnam. But between that and between Vietnam and where she was in the Hungarian uprising, she traveled around the world covering multiple wars. She kind of covered the Indo-Chinese War in 1962, I believe. She had gone to Algeria, which was her first major assignment that she was able to get. And the reason why she was able to get that assignment is that there was the Algerian Civil War going on, and the Algerians had no one telling their side of the story. It was all reporting on the French, who basically at that time were, essentially the Algerian colonial owners, and didn't necessarily want to let it go. So, so they actually reached out to her, that they being the Algerian rebels reached out to her to ask her if she would come out. So she was smuggled she flew from New York to Madrid, and from Spain, she was smuggled into Algeria, just as long, I mean, literally, putting in her in the trunks of cars and things like that to get her out to Algeria to cover on the revolution, which she did. She survived that. She continued on. And the next really big thing that she did that got her a lot of attention was she was embedded. Then they didn't use the term embedded. She was allowed to accompany Fidel and Raul Castro in his inner circle during the Cuban uprising, the Cuban rebellion. Now, the problem for Dickey is that she was a Rabbinetta communist, which, being a guest in a Hungarian prison known as the House of Horrors, didn't actually make her didn't warm up to any of the communists around the world. So she didn't realize that Fidel was as rabid of a communist as he was. She thought it was maybe, well, maybe sort of a benign, kind of collectivist communism or something like that. But and he was actually getting rid of a pretty bad dictator. The person who was the president of Cuba at the time was not a nice guy, and was also dealing with assassinations of the population, torture, and all that kind of thing. Well, of course, she was mortified after she had given Fidel this publicity. I mean, almost had become a press agent for Fidel and Raul, and then he turns out to be as bad as Batista, if not worse, actually. And so she was mortified by that. So it was something that really that plagued her for a long time. And later on, she did try and make amends by working with some of the Cuban exile groups in the United States that hoped to go back to retake Cuba, which kind of fell apart with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. That just didn't work, unfortunately. So she did continue on with this business. And then she, early on in 1961, 1962, had started going to Vietnam. Before it was the Vietnam War as we knew it. At that time, it was, essentially it was primarily a civil war between the North and the South, and essentially there were U.S. advisors that were there that were assisting the South Vietnamese South Vietnamese military and South Vietnamese government in trying to prevent a communist overtake of South Vietnam. And so from that standpoint, she was one of the early reporters. What's interesting when you look at her work from that period is it doesn't really look like what we see now. We see so many images from 1965 on, after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed in 1964, and we had this tremendous buildup. Most of the imagery that we see, primarily courtesy of Vietnam War movies and things that were made after the fact, we sort of see what Vietnam ultimately became for a very, very large number of people that were out fighting the war and people that were at home watching the war on television. So we missed this counterinsurgency that we are essentially supporting in Vietnam. And so, and again, I just don't have enough pictures in here. There's a few later on that I have that'll give you a little bit of an idea of what Dickey saw. By the time she had got there in 1965 on her fourth trip, she had seen really kind of an evolution from U.S. advisors that were supporting the Vietnamese Navy, the Vietnamese Marine, Vietnamese troopers, and Vietnamese, well, I guess that's it. There's Army, Navy, Marines. Anyway, sorry about that. She had, started looking like this, carrying an M16, which she did on several occasions, because of the fact that her life was so dangerous. And there was a precedent for this. For those of you who have seen the movie We Were Soldiers, which was based on a book called We Were Soldiers Once and Young, co-written by Joe Galloway, who was a young reporter in Vietnam at the time, who actually met Dickey Chapelle just before he went off to cover the Army at the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, which was then the subject of the book, which then became the subject of the movie. And if you've seen the movie, you know that Joe Galloway basically, essentially it's like, we don't need you to do this. We need you to take this, and you need to, you're a soldier now, son, type of thing. Well, Dickey actually had some of those same types of experiences. And this is one of the photos that kind of validates. It's like, yep, they gave her an M16 that was hers, and she, was basically, really more so doing more than just being a reporter. Her primarily job was reporting. This was really more for her safety. So here are a couple of photos, and you can see this is a U.S. Army. Oh, you know what? I guess. I think I triggered it a little earlier. So in any case, you can see that she was working with the U.S. advisors in Vietnam that were supporting, in that particular case, the Vietnamese medical corps that were, essentially were using American helicopters to medevac South Vietnamese soldiers. So this picture here, however, you can see there's a group of Vietnamese soldiers or Marines, I'm not actually sure which, that are with this gentleman who's an American, and you can see that he's holding, essentially, I think it's a burp gun or grease gun. I never can remember which one it is, but it's a submachine gun. And so this picture is noteworthy because it showed for the first time publicly that American advisors in Vietnam were doing much more than just actually advising. They were getting involved in actual combat operations and things like that. And this sort of proved it. And actually, this photo did run in National Geographic, and the National Geographic folks, to their credit, actually had to sort of fight with the Pentagon because they were trying to convince them not to run it. They didn't go so far as insisting, saying you must do this, but they are trying to convince them that this would be in the best interest of national security without going so far as telling them absolutely unequivocally you cannot use this photo. So this photo ended up being an award-winning photo from the National Press Photographers Association in 1963. So it's one of her really noteworthy photos that emerged because it showed something that at the time Americans had not seen American advisors doing anything other than actually advising. So it's an important picture from Dickey's standpoint. So this is one of those ones that's another ones I mentioned. There's a couple of, I'm really sorry this one got away. So this is a photo of a prisoner, a suspected Viet Cong prisoner who was captured, and essentially you can see he's tied up and he's got a few people around there not treating him very nicely behind barbed wire, and basically she did end up getting quite a few of those photos, and basically what's interesting about this is just this dynamic that I didn't know until Joe Galloway had told me this only just a few years ago, and that was that when he met Dickey, which again was in 1965, just before he went off to the Battle of the Yadrang Valley, and she went off to cover what was called Operation Black Ferret, that she had told him that when she was in the Hungarian prison, that she was treated pretty badly, but they also would drag her out periodically and, essentially stand her up against the wall in a courtyard, and she would hear a Hungarian ready, aim, fire, and they would click and they would do mock executions of Dickey in order to try and rattle her, so it was a pretty tough time. So Dickey actually took a lot of these pictures, but she actually felt sympathy for these guys, even though she hated communists with a passion, but she still had compassion as a human being for other human beings that were being treated poorly. And so, I think that that's an interesting correlation or corollary to what she had gone through and seeing what she actually was reflecting in her film or in her pictures, which is very similar to this whole idea about her first work was covering, essentially not war, but the aftermath of war, which can be pretty awful, and see the casualties and the consequences on both the combatants and then also on civilian populations. So this is another one of my favorite pictures because, oh, you know what? I think I triggered this too early. Oh, well. No, I guess I didn't. I guess I have a couple of places where I probably had incorporated a transition. So I didn't want to get to this one yet. So let me just go back to the other one. Yep, there we go. So this is a photo. This was actually also in National Geographic. And I think that's a great picture because to me, it says it all about what the horror of war is. Imagine that this is in your neighborhood and your kids have to plug their ears while there's shelling going on, and so hopefully it's not going to hit you. But we all know that in a lot of these villages and things that they saw atrocities, really that are unspeakable that no children should have to grow up seeing, but they do. And that's, again, one of the horror stories of war that I think Dickey really wanted to reinforce, is that this is something that just doesn't affect the combatants. It doesn't affect just the civilian populations, the adults, but it also affects children. And those are some things that you just can never change, and you don't get away from that. So anyway, here we go on to the next one. So now we're back to where we started, which is Dickey's last day. And there's something I want to read you because I want to make sure that I get to this, because there's so many things that I think about with Dickey that are important, and I like some of the things that were in her own words. And this is one thing that I think is really, really appropriate that I'd like to share. So this was something that she said around her time in Vietnam, and that is, sometimes if there's something I have to do that I'm not real enthusiastic about, like stepping off, especially at night, into absolute nothingness from an airplane, because the troops I'm covering are doing this, I say to myself, all right, let's not do this like a bunch of boys. They have to have a jump master, a brass band, 3 slogans, and a sergeant. You do it like a girl, just go do it. And I think that, to me, aside from the fact that Nike grabbed onto that, 40 years later, 30 years later, I think that, really it says so much about her personality, because, Dickey did not consider herself to be a feminist, although I think that she was. But I think that what she really was after was just this idea of, if I'm capable of doing a job, why shouldn't I be able to do it? Why should there be these artificial boundaries and obstacles? And we see that still played out, because it was only a few years ago that we had all restrictions against or for women against women serving in combat removed. And, you know, what's again interesting to me today is the number of women that have actually been killed in combat operations or in combat support operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's almost no reporting on it. You know, and at first I thought, it's like, well, that's kind of strange because there were so many objections to women women in combat roles or being in the military in the first place, you know, or even in Dickey's case, you know, she wasn't always welcome when she showed up to report on something. So that was something that she had to fight, which was not only with the military, but also with male reporters. Now, over time, she earned the respect of the military and also a lot of male reporters who she befriended because she had demonstrated that she had what it took in order to become a really top-notch, tough war correspondent like the rest of them. So eventually they did accept her, which I think is, you know, which is great. And maybe there's a lesson for all of us today that if you persevere long enough and you demonstrate that you're really good at what you do, that your gender, your race, sexual orientation and things becomes a lot less important. But this day in particular is interesting because again, you know, she was just on a patrol with the Marines in Vietnam. It was an operation called Black Ferret. It was a search and destroy mission, which really wasn't that successful. They did end up, you know, in engaging some Viet Cong. There were a few, you know, people that were captured and things, but it was probably not that much of a success. From the standpoint of what they were really hoping for, the reason for the operation, which was pretty big because they had a bunch of media on it. Dickey was not the only reporter that slipped into this. Not only was she there, there was also the person who took this photo. There were multiple others that, you know, that were there that had seen this. And also what I found out from one of the Marines who was actually supposed to be on that patrol, who was a Marine public affairs officer who was actually ordered the day before to not go on that patrol in the morning because he had to wait for Morley Safer, who some of you may recognize was a very famous correspondent for 60 Minutes who did report on the Vietnam War. And so, you know, it was a pretty high profile operation. They just didn't go anywhere. The problem is that Dickey happened to be walking, you know, close to somebody on point. The Marine ahead of her tripped a booby trap that exploded an 82 millimeter grenade and a mortar and a grenade combination. And basically it sprayed shrapnel out. She was the second person in line. It caught her directly in multiple places, but it caught a carotid artery. So out of the 7 people wounded, which were 6 Marines and Dickey Chapelle, the only one that died was Dickey Chapelle. So it's just sort of this irony that, you know, what she was doing was so dangerous that, you know, she managed to essentially go with a group of Marines, and she was unfortunately the only one that died in that explosion. But again, the picture itself is pretty harrowing, and I'm sorry to have it up for such a long time. But there's one final thing. Well, maybe not a final thing. One more thing I do want to read to you, which is, there we go. At the time that Dickey was in Vietnam, she had been corresponding with General Wallace M. Green Jr., who was a commandant of the Coast Guard. I'm sorry, commandant of the Marine Corps. Sorry, my Coast Guard slipped in. And her death was considered to be so important that the commandant of the Marine Corps released an all-Marine message about her death. And so this is what he said. So, pardon my reading. All U.S. Marines the world over mourn the death of Dickey Chapelle, who died of wounds received while covering combat operations by Marines in South Vietnam on November 4th, 1965. She was not only a skilled, dedicated newspaperwoman, but she was an exemplary patriot whose great love for her country was an inspiration to all who knew her and worked with her. It has been said by her media colleagues that she died with the men she loved. It must also be said that affection, admiration, and respect was mutual. She was one of us, and we will miss her. And to my knowledge, there has not been another message that's been released like that. So I think that that Dickey's reverence and respect by the Marine Corps really says it all. And again, it's something that there are a lot of war correspondents, and there's a lot of good ones, but you know what, to earn the respect of the Marines is I think is pretty special. And it was also true of the other military. I mean, there were a lot of folks that were Army guys, Air Force, Navy, and even Coast Guard guys that had that had come across Dickey and had a tremendous amount of respect for her. So we're at the end. I do have about just a minute and a half of photos that I can show you. It'll go pretty quick, but I want to make sure that if anybody has any questions, now would be a good time to get there. And I'm going to maybe go over to this, and then we've got Dickey Chapelle's famous. I should have gotten to this earlier. And I'm going to leave this here for a moment in the event that there's any questions.
John, we do have one question that's on the Q&A, and I have another list of various questions to put for you. So why don't you go answer that Q&A? Can you click on it, or did you want me to do that?
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to lose a screen share in order to do that, though.
Okay, well, let me do that then.
Okay.
Okay, so the question said, this is from Brittany. I came in slightly after the start of the program. Forgive me, I was, if this was already explained. She asks if Dickey struggled at MIT at all because she was female and faced any kind of discrimination being in those early, exalted groups of women that were able to get into MIT, or was it she just couldn't keep herself out of the National Guard?
So basically,
sorry, was
no,
it not National Guard?
and that's a great question. And she never wrote about any explicit, that I know of anyway, explicit discrimination. But I think that she was just thrilled to be there. I think that she was very, very excited. And I think that there were a couple of things that had undermined her her academics. One was she was interested in journalism, so I think she did take a journalism class, and so that gave her a good reason to go out and find these quote interesting to her stories, which centered around aviation. The other thing is that at the time that she was at MIT, that Admiral Byrd lived in Boston. So I don't want to say that she was stalking, but apparently she knew that his townhouse was brown, so obviously she had been by there. And so as far as I know, at least she never wrote about knocking on his door or anything like that. I mean, maybe she did, but she had enough sense not to write about that. But it really was more a matter of her not spending enough time in classes. So she really had kind of shot herself in the foot academically. And she also had some success with writing a couple of stories that were published in Boston newspapers. So so she was kind of living the good life, away from mom and dad, hanging out with a bunch of sailors and Coast Guardsmen, and doing something that she really, really liked. So it was unfortunate that she had not been successful there, but it was not because of any particular overt discrimination. It was really more her own doing.
Well, she was enjoying herself anyway.
Well, there was a story that she read, an unpublished story, which I think is probably good that it wasn't published, but it was something about, it was something about a co-ed's experience with necking or something like that. I mean, it was pretty funny, actually. So that never got published, and I think it probably was to her advantage that was never published. I think that might have haunted her later on. She admitted it, but it's buried in her archive.
Yeah, I think that it would have diminished her career.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would have, especially when she was young, it would have anybody, if the male reporters that she was working with had known that. And I'm sure that she was probably hit on a lot more than she actually wrote about, just by just essentially the mores of the day type of thing.
Right. Okay. I'm intrigued that you have this history with the Coast Guard and her history with the Coast Guard. Is that where your paths crossed and you became interested in Dickey Chapelle as a topic, or how did you make her acquaintance as a topic and want to do this book?
So that's a great question. That's another one that I do get a lot. And I would say that I had never heard of Dickey Chapelle ever. I mean, it was like completely, it might have been like, any other name just randomly picked up, and I would have had no recollection or awareness of who she was. But I was actually reading a book called Brownwater Black Beret, which was written by a guy named Thomas Cutler, who was in the Brownwater Navy during Vietnam. And he wrote Brownwater Black Beret, which was about the Brownwater Navy in Vietnam. And so we're talking about things like, like the PBRs that you would have seen in Apocalypse Now, and various other operations that were there. The Coast Guard was included in that. The Coast Guard actually participated in the coastal and riverine interdiction with the Navy in Vietnam, and also had some large ships that were out there that were doing fire support missions and all that kind of stuff. So that was why I got the book, because I had heard that there was some great Coast Guard stories about, there's some stories about the Coast Guard, including at the time I was assigned to an 82-foot patrol boat, which was actually one of the craft that was in Vietnam. Now, the Coast Guard actually sent a bunch of ships to Vietnam and left them there, which is actually very, very common a lot of times when you're doing these things and you're supporting a government that you're hoping is going to survive and things like that. So you want to reconstitute their navy when the war is over and stuff. So it's kind of ironic actually that that didn't quite work out for us. But for me, it worked out great because there was one chapter in that book about Dickey Chapelle, and I was reading the story about this women war correspondent running around in Vietnam, and then it's like, oh, and by the way, she started reporting on wars in World War II at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the Marines loved her. It's like, how come I've never heard of this woman before? It was just to me, just astounding to me that I never heard of her, and that nobody else apparently has heard of her either. It's really something that kind of is troubling to me even to this day, because this has been something that I was dealing with for a long time. As I came across a story like in 1992, I'm sad to say. And so it was really just absolute happenstance that I happened to read a book that had a chapter about Dickey Chapelle in it.
Oh, what a great coincidence that happened. I absolutely love the book. I'm stunned by the photos in it. Just for everybody listening, we're going to put the link up with the recording of John's program tonight so that you can access it that way. And also, if you that to get to your own copy, or if you want to get a copy through the library system, we have our copy here at the library. I'm now willing to surrender it, so it will be available for checkout, but it is within the system. So do you think that pre-Vietnam big photo publications like Life and Look and National Geographic were part of the reason that Dickey got such great visibility, because they were big photo spread publications that highlighted these kinds of images? And some of that went away because of video and in Vietnam. Do you think that she was able to tell her story in these stills in a way that she would not have been able to necessarily in Vietnam? Although I know she has stills there too, but it was a different time where we watched Walter Cronkite and video every night.
Yeah. So Dickey had an interesting career from the standpoint that she got herself to a lot of places. She saw a lot of really fascinating things, but she did work for different publications. As I mentioned, she was with 17 magazine early on. Her first photos were actually published in Look magazine, which was a pretty big deal at the time. But that ended pretty quickly. So I think she had maybe 3 photo spreads in Look, and which again was the #2 photo magazine. Life was #1, and then when World War II rolled around, she was actually she got her assignment to go cover the Panamanian training and stuff like that of the 14th Infantry Division from a publication called Fairchild Publications, which I think is still around today. And they actually ended up not using any of her material. Oh, you know what? I think Fairchild was when she was in Iwo Jima. Sorry. So let me fast forward then to when she was in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She was working for Fairchild Publications, and they didn't use any of her publications. She didn't use any of her photos at all. So that was obviously a big disappointment for her. But she was able to get a photo spread in 1945 in Cosmopolitan, which did include some of those pictures. Now, Cosmopolitan at the time was not the magazine that it is today. It had a completely different, different bent and things like that. But, again, so 1945, the Cosmopolitan was not as well known of a publication as it was today, because it was still fairly new. But she did, have some interesting publications at that time. I mean, Look certainly was a big outlet. Then later on, when she was doing a lot of the relief work, there were a couple of articles that she and Tony collectively had published in National Geographic, one in 1952, and the other one, I want to say it's 55. I've got them back here. I always forget that, but I think 52 and 55 or so, maybe 54. And so, again, National Geographic, huge magazine, big readership at the time. But, again, it was not the kind of thing, and unfortunately, I don't think that it got her the notoriety that she may have deserved. It was almost one of the things that was in the in the realm of the sort of the filler of National Geographic, which every single, for at least in that era, all the pictures were great, all the articles were really fascinating, and all that. So it's really hard to pull somebody out of National Geographic and say, oh yeah, that's a so and so picture. And it was also complicated because everything at that time that Tony and Dickey did, they credited to photo by Tony and Dickey Chapelle. So it's really hard to tell which Chapelle took which photo. I mean, you can conclude that maybe they're probably the better ones probably were Tony's, just because of the fact that that was his sole emphasis. He didn't care about words other than for photo captions. He was actually a pretty good writer, though, interestingly enough. But that wasn't his passion. So I think that over time, it just was just her time ran out because she had worked for a lot of years for Reader's Digest, like when she was in Cuba. Those stories were published by Reader's Digest. But then by the end of 1950s, that started kind of drying up a little bit. So she was doing a lot more hustling to get work. And I don't know if it was because she was getting older, and there is also age discriminations on top of gender discrimination as well. But she had to hustle a lot for work. So she managed to get some notoriety with the Vietnam stories, the early Vietnam stories, which did help get her a book contract. She won an Overseas Press Club award for her reports in Vietnam and partially for her book. But that was in like 1962 or so. So then she was doing some work for the National Observer, and and basically she had another assignment from National Geographic. In 1964, but the National Geographic decided not to publish her story. They were complaining about the quality of her photos, and as her stepson said, that Dickey never met a light meter that she liked. So she was much more of a get into this place, catch this dramatic moment, and she was less concerned about some of the technical elements of it, which I think now looking back on it from a historical perspective or historiography, it's fine. I mean, it's like she caught a moment. That was her goal. She wanted to prove that she was here capturing this moment, and she accomplished that objective. The problem is that she didn't make a lot of money doing it towards the end, and she was still hustling for work towards the bitter end. And so essentially, her last story was that story that National Geographic had refused to publish, which they then published posthumously. So it did eventually get its sort of day in the court of public viewing, but you know what? It was almost a little bit too late. So she had an interesting and some of her work was great, but it was really tough. And I have to say, I finally heard the best response about why that might be. And I did a panel sometime at the National Press Club with Jackie Spinner, who did the foreword of the book, who was also a war correspondent herself, and then Edie Lederer, who was I think she was for a long, long time, she was the Associated Press reporter at the UN, but she also, in her early career, reported on Vietnam in 1972. So she didn't know Dickey, but she certainly knew of her and knew her reputation. And she had a great take on it. It's like the reason why we don't know Dickey as well as we probably should is because she was a freelancer. So when she died, there was a big splash about it, but nobody owned her. So nobody owned her enough to kind of, perpetuate her memory as somebody that died while they were working for Life magazine or whatever it may be. National Geographic probably did the best job that they could at the time, but then they do use her photos periodically. They will pop up, in some of their books and things like that. But, again, National Geographic has tons of really great photographers, so it's hard to really break out, unfortunately. So that's Dickey's, again, more of her sad legacy.
Well, I found her writing to be as profound and penetrating as her photos. She is eloquent in her speech and in her visuals.
Yeah.
I think the two work so well together, and you can tell almost that it's from the same person.
Uh-huh.
It's almost a feeling rather than anything that you can separate into, text and photo.
Yeah.
I was interested in that, and I think it would be hard to pull it back up, but I was interested in that photo that you pulled out. It was the prisoner in Vietnam, and you said that she was, vehemently anti-communist, but yet sympathetic because of her time in Hungary, in
Yeah.
prison, sympathy with the prisoner. And I think that it shows, and tell me how you feel about this, that she was not judgmental in her photo. She allowed the viewer of that photo to understand it personally and come to an opinion
Yeah.
of what was going on and what should be felt.
Right. I think that that's a fair assessment. She was definitely cognizant of the fact that her photos were not only for her.
Yeah, it was quite a remarkable look. And as I've gone through the book, I've seen that in other photos, but I think you pulling out that one particularly was a good example of that. I just have another question personally. When she was
Yeah.
in the prison in Hungary, how did her news of her being in prison get out? Was it through the channels of like the Red Cross, or how did that happen?
So it was more than one. It was more than one thing, and actually, it was reported. Her capture had been reported, so there was some media coverage on it. Since there were other people that were around that knew about it. One of the folks that she had come across during her Hungarian uprising days was James Michener, and who wrote a book called The Bridget Andau, which he references Dickey Chapelle, not by name, because at the time he wrote it, he was concerned about anything that might happen to her if it sort of validated the fact that she was actually there, type of thing. But there were, yeah, it was something that was reported, and so people did know about it. And then of course at the time Tony was was trying to help get her out, which eventually it became too much of a liability for her. She didn't admit to being a spy, so they couldn't just execute her. Then it became too well known of a story, and and essentially there was apparently some diplomatic pressure that finally started being applied that helped lead to her release. She actually was tried and accused and convicted of illegal border crossing, so and expelled from Hungary for life, type of thing. But she could have been convicted of things and spent a lot more time in prison. But I think at that point, the Hungarians just wanted it to go away, and the Russians too, I'm sure. They just wanted the story to go away.
She was a wonderful combination of brains and the ability to capture facts and empathy, and yet she was in a more powerful way, really a little mischievous. I mean, being able to defy the orders and get on the boat and go over to the shore, to that airfield that was in Okinawa. No, that was in Iwo Jima, I guess, or was
Yeah.
that
Okay, it was Okinawa. Yeah.
Okinawa? Yeah, and off she went. She'd done it before. She got her hand slapped. She did it again someplace else.
Yeah.
So, I think that's, well, what would you think that was?
Well, I think that it was just pragmatic. She was obviously competing with a lot of folks, so she wasn't the only one there. But I think it also is just sort of the nature of being a good reporter. You have to be persistent because, again, a lot of times reporters are reporting on things that are not necessarily favorable to people that are being reported on, especially if it's positions of people in power, governments, and things like that. So I suspect that it was just kind of the chutzpah that's expected of a reporter in order to get what they want. Especially, even when you see some news conferences nowadays, you see this gaggle of reporters that are all, jockeying for position to get in and get their, the recording device in or get a camera in or something like that in order to, to get a sound bite or, or an image or something like that. So, so I think it's just the ethos of being a good reporter is that you have to be, you have to be willing to go in there and and shove your way into to the front. Otherwise, you're never going to get the story.
Well, I was very drawn to her as a person,
Hmm.
and to see that she was able to make this go through this over and over again in all these different war zones, none of
Hmm.
them easy, was quite remarkable. And
Yeah.
using her cunning and her chutzpah, as you say, to tell the story for the rest of us.
Right.
Very important. Well, I know we're running over time, so I don't want to keep everyone. I don't want to keep you, John. I want
There's
to
one
thank
point that
everyone.
I do have to make, though. Really, this is important, especially since
Sure.
you mentioned the book, and so thank you for mentioning the book. But unfortunately, the publisher elected not to do a second printing of it. So right now I'm working getting the rights back and all that kind of stuff, and I'm going to try and find another publisher. I could probably self-publish it at this point since it's already been out. So I'm not worried about the stigma of self-publishing. But the ebook is actually still available. So the ebook is obviously, it's not ideal, but certainly you can, if you really are interested in looking at more of the story, you can do that. And if if you're okay with it, I can go ahead and show you some of the pictures, some were in the book and some not, which comes up next. It's about a minute and a half, maybe.
Sure.
Is that
We'd love to have that. I
all
think
right?
that would be
Great. So
great.
let's go on to the next one and see what we've got here. So this is just coming from oh, come on, why aren't you going through? Oh, you know why? Let's do this. There we go. So, you know what I forgot about Slam? That's Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, and he wrote a post obituary. I call it the post obituary about Dickey, because he was a well-known military historian. But before that, he had been a reporter in Detroit. I can't remember if he's for the Detroit Free Press or the Detroit News, but he was an old newspaper guy before World War II. And essentially, he came in and he ended up in the historian role, and then ended up being elevated to brigadier general. But he and Dickey were good friends, and so he wrote this moving. I think actually, to me, it was a prophetic curse in a way about Dickey Chapelle. And I'm just going to read you 2 paragraphs, if you don't mind, 3 actually. So this was in 1965, was about 2 weeks after she died. It was in the LA Times, an op-ed. And basically he called the death to slighted Dickey Chapelle. And so in the story, he just talked about the injustice of her. And even at that point, there were some things that were really very, very interesting. But he said, no one saw fit to mention she was the first American female war correspondent killed in action. No male war correspondent in our time had a comparable record. Most of the time, the men got the glory and the bylines while she was doing things the hard way. She had the stark, steady courage they lacked. And I thought that was great. And it was also terrible because nothing's changed. In my opinion, there's nothing that's changed since 1965. She still gets, essentially, I think, diminished every step along the way, and I think it's really unfortunate. I would say that in 2017, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, with some help and some prodding from me to the Marine Corps Combat Correspondents Association, and they ran with it. They were able to get the Commandant to designate her an honorary Marine, which is a really big deal. There's only a few journalists, Joe Galloway being one of them, that have gotten that recognition and stuff. So that was, I think, a somewhat of a vindication. But then shortly thereafter, it was crickets about Dickey Chapelle. And there's people that still do some writing about her and things like that. And so it's not just about that. It's just that she just has not bubbled up to that level of collective knowledge. And I think that some of what Marshall wrote about in there, it's maybe we're rocking the boat about preaching who is empowered to be a war correspondent. Maybe it's not women, maybe it's supposed to be men. I don't know. All right, so here's some of the photos. This was a picture taken by somebody who was killed shortly after he took that picture. He was one of the Navy advisors in Vietnam, named Harold Dale Meyercourt, and he was essentially this Navy advisor that was basically everything that she felt what an American warrior should be. And it was really tragic that he didn't survive the war. So hopefully this will start automatically. This is from World War II. That is King Hussein of Jordan. She went to jump school at the age of 40, which is pretty amazing. That's one of my favorite pictures, actually. This was taken in the Dominican Republic. Now we're back to Vietnam. And so this is a modern selfie. So I'm going to kind of go back, I think. Let's leave it on the selfie.
There you go.
So there you go. That's Dickey Chapelle. Oh, I don't want to go to this. So anyway, you can certainly find the book here, or the ebook anyway. And that's, me on Twitter. The Facebook page has got a lot of pictures, a lot more pictures about Dickey and things like that. So that's another place that you can always check out if you're so inclined. And so hopefully I'll be able to get the book back and published, back in print, in the near future. But unfortunately, I had to focus on some other things and had to kind of put it in the back burner. But I'm kind of looking back at Dickey now, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So hopefully, your faithful audience got something out of this. And if you have any follow-on questions, go ahead and shoot me an email. I'm happy to respond to anybody's questions.
John, I'm really glad you put this slide up because I didn't have one and I probably should have, but there is the book in the corner, and it truly is remarkable. And I too hope you get the rights back to it. I would encourage everyone to read it.
Yeah, I finally got that part sorted out. Now it's just a matter of figuring out what to do with it. So, ideally, it's just something that I hadn't expected with a publisher that operates as an historical press. So it's just one of those things. And we have a very good relationship, and so it's always about the budget, as you know. So
that's true. Well,
but I did find out that actually, because I look at it periodically, because I don't have that many copies of the book myself, and so I was actually buying them back when I found some that came open. And the last time I checked, there's a couple of books that are out there that are being sold for more than $1,000, and it's like, what are you guys, crazy?
Well, it is a remarkable compendium of her pictures and her thinking. I mean, it's a wonderful document. I put it in every journalism class, right?
Oh,
I mean, it really is excellent.
I think so too, but it's, it was, the book won awards and all that kind of stuff, which doesn't always matter, but the reviews were great, and so I'm very, very happy with the way the book turned out. There's only a couple of things that I would do differently. It was never the cover photo, and it was something that the publishers and I had kind of gone back and forth on. We had some differences of opinions of that, but it's a great photo, so I can't complain too much about it. And as I said, they put together a really good book, so I was really happy to be part of it.
Yeah, well, it's excellent. We really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed tonight's program. I'm sure our audience did too. We hope to keep in touch, see what else is happening out there. You have had quite a storied career in California in the movie industry, and that's another whole program.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. So, yeah, it's really funny because I was talking to my wife the other day, and I was going to update my IMDb page, which is really not that broad, because I spent most of the time working in entertainment prior to the Coast Guard. I was basically in advertising and marketing and stuff. But when I was in college, I actually took a class from Lucille Ball, and my wife said, "I don't know if you should put that in there. That's going to kind of date you." And I said, honey, it's like, when I walk into the room, do you think they're not going to know how old I am? I mean, so it doesn't really make any difference at this point. So,
well, there you go. And
well, again, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll be able to do this in person sometime.
Okay, thanks very much, John, and thank you to our audience for sticking with us. And we will hopefully see you next week. Thank you again, and good night.
All righty. Good night, everybody.
Good night.